In 2005, I watched my best friend wave from the back of her uncle's truck as it turned up the gravel road toward French Creek Trail. She pressed her hand to the window, her pink backpack strapped too tight over her shoulders, and smiled like it was any other weekend. That was the last time anyone in town saw her. And the last time I ever believed things like that only happened in other places. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and if stories like this ever touched your life, hit like and subscribe. Sometimes a single voice can bring another name back into the light. My name is Lauren Mitchell. I'm 38 now, living in Flagstaff, Arizona, where I teach high school history. But I grew up in Custer, South Dakota, a mountain town so small we didn't need traffic lights, just porch lights and curfews. Back then, I lived on Cedar Street, 3 blocks from the diner, 1 mile from the trailhead, and half a world away from anything bad. My dad ran the hardware store. My mom cleaned cabins in the summer. We weren't rich, but I always had lunch-packed shoes that fit and a front porch chalked with names and games and childhood secrets. That summer, I was 8. Ellie Dawson had just turned 9. We met the year before in 2nd grade. She'd moved from Rapid City after her parents divorced, and she asked me on the first day of school if I thought trees could remember us. That's the kind of girl she was, always thinking in questions that made adults stop and blink. We spent that summer naming every tree on our block, building capes out of pine needles and mapping out pretend trails with made-up signs. Ellie wanted to be a park ranger. I told her I'd write the missing person books that helped people find each other again. I didn't know how close to the truth that would come. Her Uncle Greg was a quiet man, former Army medic, clean-cut, soft-spoken. He'd bring her to school when her mom had early shifts. Everyone said he was good with kids. When Ellie told me he was taking her on an overnight camping trip, just the 2 of them, she was so excited she couldn't sit still. Said it was a surprise birthday gift. She left on a Saturday morning. The air smelled like pine sap and rain still trapped in the earth. I remember that because we sat on the curb outside her house and made one more promise that we'd never take off the necklaces we made together the summer before. Little silver hearts from the trading post. We'd etched our names into them with safety pins and bitten them like kids do to leave a mark. Hers said Ellie. Mine said Lauren. That night I drew a new trail map. I labeled the spot she'd be camping Ellie's watchtower. She was supposed to be back by Sunday evening. By Monday morning, the phone hadn't rung. No one had come down the road. I remember my mom standing at the sink looking out the window, the dishwater gone cold. I didn't understand what was wrong. Not yet. But when I walked to the school bus stop and Ellie wasn't there, not sitting on the guardrail, not swinging her legs like she always did, I felt something in my chest go very still. Like the woods were holding their breath, and they still haven't let it out. The bus pulled away, and I stood there alone at the edge of the road, listening for anything. A car door, a voice, even bird song. But the only sound was wind moving through pine. By then, it was late Monday morning. Ellie was supposed to be home Sunday afternoon. Nobody said anything at first, just little murmurs behind hands at the diner or quiet glances between neighbors. My mom called Karen Dawson that night. I remember her hanging up the phone and staring out the kitchen window without saying a word. It wasn't until the sheriff's cruiser pulled up to the Dawson house the next morning that everything shifted. That was the moment the town realized something was wrong. Not just delayed, not just lost, something else. Greg Dawson had signed into the trailhead logbook at 12:13 p.m. on Saturday. A ranger remembered seeing them, Ellie, in her pink backpack, asking about bears. Greg polite, a little rushed. They were headed toward French Creek Trail, planning to camp overnight. Weather was fine. They had gear. Nothing raised alarms. When they didn't return, Karen said she waited a day before calling. She thought maybe they'd taken an extra night, gotten sidetracked. But she didn't know what else to say, and the call to the sheriff's office didn't come from her, it came from Ellie's grandfather. Search teams mobilized fast. Volunteers, dogs, choppers. It became the kind of effort that swallowed a whole town. People stopped going to work. My mom stayed up late folding maps and bagging sandwiches for the search crews. I watched from the front steps every night, hoping one of those searchers would walk Ellie up the porch hand in hand, just dirty and scared. That never happened. They found nothing. Not a sock, not a boot print, not a snapped branch that led anywhere. Just silence. After the second week, a red shoelace was found snagged in a bush 2 miles off trail. It matched a pair of sneakers Ellie wore all the time, white canvas pink laces. But that was it. There was no way to tell if the shoelace had fallen there that weekend or been dropped months earlier. Still, the search narrowed. The press came and went. State officials gave statements. At school, her desk stayed empty, her cubby untouched. I walked past it every morning. My mom said nothing, just packed my lunch and made sure I didn't forget my raincoat. We didn't talk about Ellie. Not directly, but sometimes I'd catch her folding my clothes with too much care, or pausing when she brushed my hair like she was checking to make sure I was still there. A few neighbors started whispering things about Greg. Not loudly, but enough that I heard. He was quiet, kept to himself. His army records said he'd been a medic discharged honorably. But no one knew much else. Karen never said anything to me about him, but I remembered the way her voice changed when she talked to him. Tense, like she was trying not to argue. A month after the disappearance, Greg's truck was found in a public parking area near the trailhead. Locked, clean, no blood, no belongings, no note. The tank was half full. One ranger said it looked like it had been parked there the whole time. The FBI came and went. Interviews were conducted. Flyers were posted. Then they weren't. Eventually, the sheriff's office released a statement saying the case was suspended due to lack of new leads. That was 8 months after Ellie vanished. 8 months, and all we had was a red shoelace and 1,000 bad theories. Some people believed Greg had taken Ellie and started over somewhere else. Others were less generous. I remember overhearing one woman at the post office say, "Well, if he did something awful, he wouldn't exactly have left her behind, now would he?" Then she paused like she realized what she'd said out loud and walked away. Ray Coleman was the lead deputy back then. He came by our house once to ask questions, just routine, he said. He asked if Ellie had ever mentioned feeling scared, or if she'd said anything about her uncle that seemed off. I told him no, that she was excited to go, that she'd promised to collect leaves and bring back stories. He didn't write much down, just nodded a lot and thanked me. My mom walked him out. I stayed at the window watching his car until it disappeared down the road. Over time, the calls slowed. Karen moved away. The Dawson house went up for sale. Our school had a quiet assembly about staying safe in the woods, but no one mentioned Ellie's name. By spring, the playground games had changed. Kids stopped pretending to be explorers. They played closer to the building. One girl asked if Ellie had been eaten by a bear. The teacher didn't correct her, just changed the subject. The thing is, for a while I believed she might come back. I checked the mail for letters. I looked for her reflection in windows. Once I saw a girl with the same haircut walking through the grocery store and followed her for 2 aisles before realizing it wasn't her. The grief didn't land all at once. It settled in pieces, and the adults didn't seem to want to talk about it. It was like something shameful had happened, and no one could figure out where to put the blame, so they just locked the whole thing in a box and walked away. But I never stopped thinking about that last morning. The way she smiled through the window. The way the light hit the necklace she always wore, the silver one we'd promised never to take off. I wondered sometimes if she still had it on, if it was lying out there somewhere in the woods tangled in leaves or caught on a branch. Then almost 20 years later, someone found it. Not a body, not a grave, just that necklace. Still intact, still hanging from a branch. And for the first time in my adult life, I felt something shift, like the air had changed, like the forest had finally exhaled. I didn't see the article myself. It was sent to me forwarded by an old classmate from Cooster I hadn't heard from in years. The subject line just said, Ellie, with a link to a local paper I didn't recognize anymore. The story was short. A hiker in the Black Hills had come across an old necklace on a pine branch just off French Creek Trail. No bones, no clothing, just the pendant. Silver, heart-shaped. 5 letters scratched in it, Ellie. I didn't click the link right away. I just stared at the name. I hadn't said it out loud in over a decade. Not since my mother made it clear we didn't talk about the Dawson family anymore. Not since the town stopped asking questions. I walked into my bedroom and opened the top drawer of an old box I never fully unpacked when I moved. Inside was my necklace, the twin of the one in the photo. Same shape, same scratch marks, same faint bite mark near the edge. Ellie and I made them the summer before she disappeared, from a trading post near the trail. Cheap silver, but we thought they were magic. We'd bitten them like kids do when they want something to stay. She wore hers the day she left. I wore mine for years afterward until the clasp broke, and now someone had found it hanging from a branch like it had been waiting for someone to notice. I called the paper the next morning. They didn't have much more to share. The man who found it had been photographing sunrise, wandered off trail, thought it looked strange. He'd turned it in to a ranger who logged it and moved on. No official investigation reopened, no press conference, just a necklace in a dusty evidence drawer. But the article kept spreading. First, a few reposts on social media, then a podcast picked it up a true crime show with a small but loyal following, and then somehow it landed on the desk of a national journalist. That's when people started asking questions again. That's when it stopped being just a trinket on a tree. It was the first time anyone outside of Cooster had mentioned Ellie Dawson's name in 20 years. And it was enough to pull me back in. I requested a week off from school. I told the principal I needed to deal with a family matter. That wasn't a lie. It just wasn't the kind of family most people talk about. I booked a one-way ticket to Rapid City. I packed a small duffel and brought the necklace. As the bus took the winding roads into town, I watched the trees go by, taller than I remembered, but still familiar. When I stepped off, the air smelled like sap and wet earth. The kind of smell that settles into your lungs and stays there. My old house had been sold years ago. I didn't go there. I went straight to the edge of town to the Timberline Inn, which hadn't changed its sign since 1995. The woman behind the counter was Jean Bell. She used to substitute at our elementary school. She looked up from her paperwork and stared at me for a long moment before speaking. "You're Lauren Mitchell," she said. I nodded. "I heard you became a teacher." "History," I replied. She didn't smile, just folded the room key into my hand and said, "So, you're here about the Dawson girl." I didn't deny it. She looked down and whispered, "Some stories here don't want to be dug up." That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at the desk in my room and opened the folder I'd carried from Arizona. Inside was the drawing Ellie made when we were kids. 2 girls in pine needle capes holding paper towel binoculars. Ranger Ellie, Ranger, Detective Lauren. That's what she wrote underneath. I never thought I'd be the one who kept the promise. But now that necklace had reappeared, and someone wanted it to be seen. I wasn't the only one who noticed. Ray Coleman, the retired deputy who led the original search, still lived in town. He didn't work anymore, but I found him listed in an old directory. I drove out to his cabin near Sylvan Lake the next morning. He answered the door slowly, squinting through the glass. I said my name. He opened it. "I didn't think I'd ever see you back here," he said. "I didn't think I'd ever come back," I replied. He made coffee without saying much. The same kitchen from years ago, same table with the scratch down the middle. I pulled the article from my bag and slid it toward him. They found her necklace. He studied it quietly. "Looks like it," he said. I laid mine beside it. He looked between them, nodded once. Yours still looks new. I kept it in a box. Hers looks like it was placed. He paused, not dropped, not weather-worn, like someone hung it on purpose. So someone came back, I asked. He didn't answer, just sipped his coffee and stared at the grain in the table. You always believed something was off, didn't you? I said, with Greg. He set his mug down and leaned back. Greg Dawson wasn't a perfect man, but I never bought the theory he ran. Not with a 9-year-old niece and no money, no plan. That trail. You can't survive long in those woods without gear. And if it was foul play, you don't get rid of every trace. He looked at me more tired than I remembered. Something about it always felt off, like we were looking in the wrong direction. What direction, I asked. He didn't answer. But before I left, he pulled something from a drawer. An old file. Not official. Personal notes. On the last page was a single line scribbled in his handwriting. She said, "Don't look back." I asked who said it. He didn't know. Just said it came from a tip one that went nowhere. That night back at the inn, I found a manila envelope under my door. No name. No stamp. Just my name written in marker. Inside was a photograph. Ellie. Older than 9. Maybe 12. Her hair longer. Eyes wide. Scared. And around her neck, her necklace. The same one from the tree. The photo looked old. Grainy. Like it had been taken on a disposable camera and kept hidden. There were no markings on the back. No date. No signature. But it meant one thing: she'd been alive after they stopped looking. That someone knew. And someone didn't want her found. I didn't sleep that night. The photo sat on the nightstand beside the lamp, half shadowed in that flickering yellow light that motels can never quite get right. I must have stared at it for hours. Ellie looked older in at 12, maybe a little more. Her face was thinner, eyes hollow, but unmistakably her. And there, hanging around her neck, was the same necklace, still there, still whole. I couldn't explain the part of me that felt guilty for letting myself forget, for pushing her memory into the corners of my life and closing the drawer. I sat with that guilt in silence until the sky began to pale. At sunrise, I walked down to the front desk. Jean Bell was already up sipping something from a floral mug that looked as old as the inn itself. She looked at me for a long second, then said, "Someone called last night, asked if you were still here." I felt a chill, but I kept my voice steady. "Did they say who they were?" She shook her head. "Just said to tell you something." She paused like she wasn't sure whether to say it. "They said, 'Stay away from the cabin.'" I nodded slowly, then asked, "What cabin?" She hesitated, then said, "There used to be talk back when it all happened, about an old shelter deep off trail, not on any maps anymore. Trapper's cabin built in the 30s. Nobody used it, not rangers, not hikers. Locals called it the quiet cabin." I asked why. She looked down at her coffee. "Because no one ever heard anything from it." I left the inn mid-morning and drove into town. I didn't have a plan, just a photo and a feeling. I stopped by the general store to grab a new notebook. As I walked through the aisles, I could feel eyes on me, people glancing, then looking away. A man near the fishing supplies muttered something I couldn't catch, something about how some folks should have stayed gone. At the counter, the cashier fumbled the change hands, shaking slightly. I didn't say anything. I just nodded and left. The town was shifting. I could feel it. That night I locked my room door and wedged a chair under the knob. It didn't help. Sometime around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of the floor creaking. Nothing loud, just enough to make your skin tighten. I turned on the light. Nothing looked out of place until I saw the necklace box. It had been moved, opened, sitting on the floor beside the bed. Nothing else was taken. No sign of forced entry, but someone had been inside. They wanted me to know. In the morning, there was a photo tucked under my windshield wiper. Greg Dawson sitting on a wooden bench in full uniform. He looked tired, eyes sunken, a fresh scar across his cheek. The corner of the photo was time-stamped September 2006. But that couldn't be right. Greg was declared dead in 2005. I drove straight to Ray Coleman's cabin. I didn't call ahead, just pulled up, got out of the car, and held up the photo as he opened the door. He stared at it for a long time. Then he let me in. We sat at the same table. I placed the photo between us. "That's him," he said. "But he looks older. Photo says 2006. That's not possible. His file says he died. 2005. Unconfirmed, but we filed it." I asked, "So what does this mean?" He didn't answer, just leaned back in his chair and rubbed his temples. Either someone changed the file, or someone wanted us to think he was gone when he wasn't. I asked if he thought Greg had taken Ellie. He shook his head. If he had, she wouldn't still be wearing that necklace. I didn't know what that meant, not exactly, but I felt the truth in it. That evening I took a walk. I didn't go far, just up the road behind the inn where the trees thinned out for a bit. The sun was low, casting long shadows over the gravel. When I got back, Jean was waiting at the front desk. "Mail came for you," she said. No stamp. Hand-delivered. Another envelope. Inside a folded note written in sharp block letters. "You're not the only one who remembers. Stop looking." I turned around, quickly scanned the lobby, the street beyond the glass door. No one. Just quiet. The kind that presses in around your ears. I didn't sleep that night either. The next morning I drove to the old Dawson house. It was still standing barely. Boarded windows. Overgrown yard. The front porch sagged and the screen door hung crooked on its hinge. I parked across the street and sat in the car for a long time. Then I got out and walked up. I didn't try the door, just checked the mailbox. Inside, tucked between advertisements and a spider web, was another note. Same handwriting. She remembered more than she should have. A twig snapped behind me. I turned quickly, heart in my throat, but there was nothing. Just the wind moving through dry grass. That night I dreamed of Ellie. She was sitting beside me on the school swings, hair-tangled eyes tired. She didn't speak. She just pointed to the woods. When I woke up, I knew where I had to go. I didn't tell anyone. I packed my bag, charged my phone, and printed the photo of Ellie from the envelope. If she had lived past 9, if she'd grown up in hiding, then someone helped her, and someone else made sure she disappeared. The trail back to French Creek hadn't changed much. The same warning signs, the same dirt lot with faded painted lines. I stood at the trailhead for a long time just listening. And somewhere deep behind the rustle of trees, I thought I heard water. And something else, faint, brittle, like the snap of wood shifting under weight. I stepped forward. Not toward the path I knew, but off it. Toward the place no one talked about. Toward the quiet cabin. The trees grew thicker the farther I went, limbs twisted inward like they were trying to keep something in. The trail markers disappeared after a few minutes, and then there was only forest, raw, dense, and deeply quiet. I kept checking my phone not for signal, but for time. An hour passed, then another. The light had shifted thinner now, as if the canopy was swallowing the sun before it could reach the ground. I wasn't sure I would have recognized the cabin if I hadn't seen the photo's first grainy shots taken by the hiker who'd found Ellie's necklace. But then, there it was, slumped between two moss-covered oaks, listing slightly to the right, its walls eaten away by weather and time. The roof sagged. The door was barely hanging on its hinges. Everything about it felt wrong. Not abandoned exactly, more like the kind of place left alone on purpose. I stood there for a long time before stepping closer. It smelled like rot and mildew, the sharp bite of rust underneath. Inside, the air was thick and still. The floorboards creaked when I stepped on them, but nothing gave way. I shined my flashlight around. A broken chair in the corner, a rusted tin can. What might have been a blanket once now just fabric and dust. And then I saw the wall. The drawings. Childlike jagged lines scratched directly into the wood stick figures trees. Something that looked like a sun with a sad face. And names. Ellie. Greg. And below them in rough, uneven letters, "Don't trust Mom." My breath caught. I stepped back slowly and looked again. It wasn't graffiti. It was a message. A warning. And not for strangers, for someone who might come looking. For me. My knees went weak for a moment, so I sat down near the far wall where the light from the broken window was brightest. That's when I saw the gap in the floorboards, something metallic tucked just beneath the rotting wood. I pried it loose gently, heart pounding, and pulled out a small tin box. Inside, wrapped in what used to be a dishcloth, was a journal. Half the pages were ruined by moisture edges curled and stuck together. But the middle pages were legible. And the handwriting, I knew it. Ellie's. Small, tight loops, sometimes slanted, sometimes shaky. The first page just said, Day 12. Uncle Greg says we can't go back yet. I asked why, and he said because she told. I don't understand. I kept reading. Day 33. I heard dogs outside again. I think they're still looking for us. I wanted to yell, but Greg said no. Day 41. Uncle Greg is sick. He keeps whispering about her coming back. I don't want her to. I want to go home. Day 47. I found a nail. I carved it into the floor. I hope someone sees it. I hope someone believes me. My throat was tight. I didn't speak. I didn't cry. I just kept reading until the last line faded off the page. She'd been here, alive, writing, hiding, waiting. I stepped back outside to get air. Ben Carter's truck was already there, parked at the edge of the clearing. He got out slowly, camera slung over his shoulder boots, muddy from the hike-in. He didn't say anything, just handed me his camera and pointed to a series of images. More carvings. Dozens of them on the outer walls. Names, initials, dates. Most were hard to read. One of them, deeply etched, almost gouged, read, She found us. I scrolled to the next photo. Do you think she meant me? I asked. Ben shook his head. I think she meant someone else. Back then. We circled the cabin together. On the back wall behind layers of lichen and soft rot were more carvings. Some were nonsense scratches, doodles, numbers, but one stopped me cold. GD 2007. That's him, I whispered. Greg. He was still alive, Ben said. 2 years after they disappeared. I nodded, tracing the letters with my finger. So, where did he go? We didn't have an answer, not yet. But we had something to go on. A name I hadn't spoken in years. Karen Dawson, Ellie's mother. I had no reason to believe she'd want to talk. But I found her address through county records. She'd remarried and moved to Rapid City, a single-story ranch with a clean lawn and white shutters. Nothing about it said guilt. But the moment she opened the door, I saw it in her face. She didn't look surprised to see me. She looked tired. Lauren, she said flatly. I held up the journal. I found her handwriting. She didn't reach for it. She didn't invite me in. You shouldn't have come. She was alive, I said. For months. Maybe years. You knew. Her expression didn't change. You need to let this go. Why did you stop looking? I asked. Silence. Then she said quietly, because I wasn't supposed to. I stood there for a long second, hoping she'd say more. She didn't. She closed the door slowly, like she'd done it before. Back in Cooster, I went straight to Ray. I showed him the journal, the carvings, the photos. He sat there silent, rubbing the bridge of his nose. I always had a feeling, he said. But no proof. Until now. So, what does it mean? I asked. It means this wasn't a disappearance, he said. It was a cover-up. I nodded. Then we need to keep digging. He flipped open the journal again and pointed to one of the drawings, something I'd barely noticed before. A bridge sketched in pencil, broken on one side. Underneath it, in faint letters, she'd written "under the crossing behind the third stone." It wasn't much, but it was more than we'd had in 20 years, and whatever it led to, I was ready to find it. Ben and I left the cabin at first light. There was a low fog hanging in the pines, enough to dull every sound but the scuff of our boots in the wet leaves. We barely spoke. I could tell he was carrying the weight of it, too, those names carved in the wood, the journal, the drawings on the wall. It felt as though the woods themselves were holding their breath. We split up the trail maps at my car and started working our way along every old bridge marked anywhere near French Creek, anything that matched the broken rail in Ellie's drawing. Some of them were nothing more than rotted planks or washed-out crossings. Most didn't look like they'd held a person in years. By the time we reached the third bridge that afternoon, I was losing faith we'd find anything. Still, we stopped at each one, counted stones, checked behind every loose board and chunk of concrete. It was nearly dusk when I knelt at a footbridge maybe a mile north of the main trail. One side collapsed, just like in the sketch. I slid my hand under the third stone knuckles, scraping on grit and roots, and felt metal, a rusted tin can. I held my breath and pulled it free. Inside, wrapped in a torn bandana, were fragments of bone, tiny, brittle, unmistakably human. There was a scrap of jaw, some teeth, and a button from what might have been a uniform. For a long moment I didn't say a word, just stared at the earth and the can and the space around us. Ben put a hand on my shoulder, didn't speak, then started taking photos for evidence. We called Ray from the car. He told us not to move anything else. By nightfall, a deputy and a coroner from Cooster met us at the bridge. They worked with quiet precision. They didn't ask why we'd been digging. Nobody seemed surprised. When Ray arrived, he took one look in the can and closed his eyes. "That's Greg," he said, voice soft, almost relieved. "That's got to be him." Back at the station, Ray pulled out a battered evidence box, dusty from years in storage. He unlocked it and showed me what was inside: a ranger's badge, stained dark Greg's notebook, and an old cassette tape. "We found these after the initial search, but the DA never pressed," Ray said. "Not enough for a case. Nobody wanted the headlines again." I stared at the tape. "Is it his voice?" Ray nodded and dug out an old player. We listened in the back office with the door shut and the blinds drawn. The recording was scratchy, but the words were clear. "If you're hearing this, I didn't do it. I didn't take her. I saved her. I hid her because they wanted her quiet. She saw something. She heard them. Her mother, the lawyer, the man from the clinic. She knew too much, and they would have erased her." I sat with those words numb. In the hallway, the evening news played softly on a mounted TV, voices far away. Ray said, "It wasn't a random crime. It was planned." I nodded. "And now someone's trying to scare us off." That night, back at the timberline, I found another note slipped under my door. "Last warning. Some girls don't get saved twice." My hands shook, but I kept moving, packing my things, checking my phone for missed calls, any sign of trouble. Ben's truck had been vandalized, red spray paint, a word I won't repeat scrawled across the side. He drove home that night, said he'd call if anything changed. I lay awake with the journal open on the bed, the cassette still echoing in my ears. In the morning, a new envelope arrived. Inside, a photo, Ellie again, older this time, holding a baby. She was smiling, eyes softer, almost peaceful. In her arms, the baby was wrapped in a blue blanket covered in tiny stars. I stared at the pattern, realizing I'd seen it years before at her house, folded on the end of her childhood bed. She had a child, I said, the words barely making it out. I went to Ray's cabin as soon as I could. He took one look at the photo and said, "She survived. All this time. She survived, and she wasn't alone." We talked for hours, combing every detail, every memory, every file Ray had kept locked away all these years. He told me about an old friend of Karen's, a pediatrician, Dr. Marcus Keene, who ran a clinic outside Cooster and vanished from public life right after Ellie disappeared. We found an address. The drive out took half an hour. Keene lived in a faded yellow house at the edge of a field oxygen tank visible behind his living room window. He answered the door slowly, peered at us over his glasses, and said he'd been waiting for someone to come. "She came here," he told us, voice thin as paper. "Late 2006. Greg brought her. She was 14, pregnant. It wasn't his child, and he wanted her safe." My breath caught, but I didn't interrupt. Keene continued. "She wouldn't say who. Greg suspected, but he never told me. She had the baby here, a boy. She called him Thomas. They left after 2 weeks. Said it wasn't safe. Greg promised to keep in touch, but he never did." Ray asked if he ever saw them again. Keene shook his head. "I always wondered if I should have done more." He wiped his face, and for a moment he looked so small I had to look away. Back in the car, Ray sat with his hands on the wheel for a long time. "We have to find out who the father was," he said, "and why Karen stopped looking." I nodded. It wasn't just about hiding. It was about protecting. That night I reread the last pages of the journal. The writing was rushed, desperate, but one line stood out. "I hope someone believes me. I promised I would. I promised I'd see it through no matter how much darkness still lay ahead." The days after meeting Dr. Keene blurred together, details crowding in until it was hard to tell what belonged to the present and what was only memory. I went over every piece of evidence with Ray, the journal, the photo of Ellie holding the baby, the list of names she'd scrawled, the tape of Greg's voice insisting he'd hidden her to keep her safe. There was a logic forming, but it was fractured, missing key pieces. We started digging into Karen's life after Ellie vanished, tracing her new married name, her move to Rapid City, and eventually a paper trail leading to a man named Stephen Rohr. The name was on old-school records, then on a sealed court complaint from 2008, marked "Confidential Minor Female." The allegation, sexual misconduct. No charges. The witness disappeared. That fact chilled me, but it didn't surprise Ray. He'd seen too many files get lost in the shuffle when people wanted them buried. We spent hours combing every resource we had for clues about Stephen's movements. He'd left South Dakota for Oregon in 2007, just a year after Ellie's baby was born. A new name, a job at a boat rental shop. Nothing about him on paper that would raise an alarm to anyone who wasn't looking for old ghosts. I visited the elementary school in Cooster, tracking down yearbooks from the years just before and after Ellie disappeared. It was almost an afterthought, one more box to check, but there in a photo on the bottom of a faded page I saw Ellie's face at age 14, eyes downcast, standing just feet from Stephen's desk. The date on the chalkboard behind her was unmistakable. It hit me then how long she'd had to live in the shadow of what happened. Ray called me the next morning. "We need to meet," he said. "The lab just finished with that film roll you found in the cabin." I drove to the station. The tech there was gentle patient, unwrapping the prints on clean paper towels. Most were a blur of light and shape, but then I saw Greg sitting by the cabin's hearth, bloodied but alive, eyes wide. Another photo showed Ellie older, cradling a baby on a makeshift bed. The last image was different. It showed Greg outside, slumped against a tree head, tilted at an unnatural angle. In the background, just visible in the glass of the cabin window, was the faint reflection of a man holding what looked like a rifle. The photo wasn't sharp, but the shape of his face was familiar. Ray enlarged the image. We both saw it at once. Stephen Rohr. I felt the floor drop out beneath me. The room was silent. Ben called that night. He'd been staying away, keeping his distance after the vandalism, but he sounded shaken. "Check your email," he said. I opened my inbox and saw a new message from an address I didn't know. There was no subject, only a photo of a teenage boy, dark hair, eyes too serious for his age, wearing a necklace. My necklace. The one I'd lost. He looked right at the camera, defiant, but underneath that I saw something familiar. The curve of his jaw, the way his mouth turned slightly at the edges, just like Ellie's. There was a message attached. "You're looking for me. I've been looking for you too." I stared at the screen, unsure if I was awake or still dreaming in the dark motel room. Another email arrived, this one with a name, Thomas. "I know who you are. I have her drawings. I want to meet." I sat back, feeling every muscle in my neck tighten. I called Ray. He said, "This is your decision. If you meet him, you do it in public in daylight." I agreed. We picked a rest stop just outside Cooster early morning when the fog was still holding to the tree line. Ben came too, just in case. Thomas arrived on a motorcycle, tall, careful, carrying a backpack and a worn plastic folder. He kept his distance at first, hovering on the far side of the picnic table. But when he finally sat down, he reached into his bag and handed me a stack of drawings. Ellie's. Some old, some recent, all signed. Most were landscapes, but a few were portraits. One of a younger me sitting under a pine hair tangled, eyes bright with questions. We sat together for a long time without speaking. When Thomas finally did, his voice was low and steady. "She died 5 years ago," he said. "It was cancer. She didn't fight it. Said she was too tired." I asked where they'd lived. He told me about moving every year, about Ellie homeschooling him, never letting him near the internet, always saying the world wasn't safe for them. "She gave me this necklace," he said, holding it up. "She told me if I ever wanted to know where I came from, I should follow it." He paused, eyes locked on mine. "She wrote about you. Said you were brave. Said you remembered things she couldn't." I felt something break inside, but I kept my composure. I told him what we'd found about Greg, about Stephen, about the years spent hiding. He listened, shoulders rigid. "Is he my father?" he asked. She didn't want to say it, but I know she was afraid. I said the only thing I could. "You get to decide who you are. He can't take that from you." He nodded, jaw clenched. "I want to find him," he said. Ray joined us later that afternoon. We showed Thomas everything, the photos, the tape, the journal. He took it all in without flinching. When we finished, he looked up at Ray. "Is there any way to prove what he did?" Ray shook his head slowly. "Not legally. Not after this much time." Thomas set his jaw. "Then I'll be his proof." We sat in silence, 3 generations of this story, all holding different pieces of the same burden. I didn't know what would happen next, but I knew I wasn't alone in carrying it anymore. Thomas stayed in town for 2 days, while Ray and I helped him sort through what little evidence we had left. There was an energy between us, heavy but charged, as if each new question might finally tip something over. He spent hours at Ray's kitchen table with the drawings, leafing through photos of Ellie as a girl, tracing the lines of her handwriting with the edge of his thumb. I noticed the way his eyes searched every page, not just for facts, but for some sign of forgiveness or belonging. We pieced together a rough timeline, tracking every movement we could find for Stephen Rohr, now going by Steve Rowley in Oregon. It was Thomas who suggested we drive out, not to confront Stephen in anger, but to end the silence. The drive west was long and mostly quiet. We crossed through counties where no one had heard Ellie's name. Thomas watched the fields slide by, his jaw set. I found myself watching him more than the road, trying to spot traces of both Greg and Ellie in his face. We pulled into a small coastal town on a gray morning, the air sharp with salt and damp earth. Stephen's house was plain paint peeling the porch, cluttered with tools and empty planters. He answered the door after the third knock, his face creasing with confusion, then something harder recognition, or maybe just fear. I stood back as Thomas spoke. "Do you know who I am?" Stephen tried to close the door, but Thomas's hand was steady. "I'm Thomas Dawson, Ellie's son." Stephen looked from me to Thomas, eyes darting. "You've got the wrong house." "You remember Ellie?" I said quietly. "You remember Greg?" Stephen shook his head, lips pressed tight. But his hands betrayed him trembling as he gripped the frame. Thomas stepped forward holding out the stack of drawings, the photo of Ellie and the baby and the lab report that had quietly linked Greg's remains to the tin can buried near French Creek. For a moment Stephen didn't move. Then his voice barely above a whisper, he said, "She said she'd ruined me. She was just a kid." My breath caught. "You were the adult. She was 13. Stephen's shoulders sagged. Then he started to close the door again, but Thomas spoke. "I want the truth. Not for you, for her." For a moment I thought Stephen would deny it all, but his next words were so small I could barely hear them. "They always believed the children. Not in Cooster." He tried to laugh, but it was a hollow sound. I lifted my phone thumb over the record button. "It's time someone did." Stephen seemed to shrink, then step back into shadow. Thomas didn't flinch. He said, "You don't get to disappear." He looked right at me, eyes clear. "Let's go." We left Stephen standing in his doorway, the silence following us down the walk. By the time we reached the car, my phone had already uploaded the recording to the cloud and sent a copy to Ray. Within hours, Ray called a contact at a local paper who shared the file with a national reporter. The headline went live by morning missing girl's son confronts abuser town's long silence broken. That afternoon, the district attorney in Cooster announced a new investigation. The story made the rounds, TV, radio, even podcasts that had once dismissed the case as just another Unsolved. The state moved quickly, but not for the reason I'd hoped. Stephen was arrested for an assault that happened years later in Oregon, a case that matched his pattern and finally stuck. The justice system rarely gives you what you want, but sometimes it gives you what you need. Back in South Dakota, I walked the streets of Cooster with Thomas. People stopped to stare. Some offered kind words, others turned away. Ray stood with us at the town square when a new memorial was unveiled, just a small plaque for children who were lost and those who carried them home. I watched Thomas trace his mother's name with one-finger lips moving in silence. He didn't cry. Neither did I. Jean Belle passed away that spring. I found a letter she'd left for me tucked into an envelope behind the front desk at the Timberline. I always believed her she wrote shaky script. I just didn't know how to help. Karen Dawson never faced charges. She moved again, changed her name. Thomas said he forgave her, but only from a distance. Some people, he said, don't deserve the last word. Ray spoke with a new heaviness, but I saw a flicker of pride in him too. The town was changing, if only by inches. As the months rolled by, Thomas enrolled in a community college outside Rapid City. He wanted to study forestry, said he wanted to protect the places that had hidden him, his mother and Greg. I returned to Arizona. My first day back, I changed my lesson plan. I started teaching my students about unsolved disappearances, not just for the facts, but for the lessons in listening in, not letting fear turn into silence. One afternoon, a student raised her hand and asked, "Why didn't anybody help her sooner?" I told her the truth. Because some people are afraid to believe in hard things, but some people aren't. I thought of Ellie, of Greg, of all the people who'd gone quiet, so the truth could finally be spoken. And I thought of Thomas carrying his mother's memory into a world that wasn't always ready to hear it. As summer warmed the Black Hills, I got a package in the mail with no return address. Inside was a photo, me and Ellie as kids, arms slung around each other's shoulders, standing at the edge of French Creek Trail, both of us holding up our necklaces. On the back, in faint pencil, "Promise you won't forget me." I hung it on my classroom wall beside a handwritten quote. Some stories are buried, but the ones we carry, they never truly leave us. That year, on June 13th, I hiked alone into the woods and sat with the trees, letting the forest remember what so many tried to erase. Spring in the Black Hills brings a kind of quiet you don't get anywhere else. Soft wind through the trees, sunlight tangled in new leaves, the ground wet with memory. It's been months since the truth about Ellie Dawson finally came to light, but some days the old ache rises up the way the mist does from the creek at dawn, gentle, stubborn, refusing to fade. Thomas and I still talk. He stayed in South Dakota, carving out a life of his own, tending to forests, the way Greg once did, planting new things where old roots were left to rot. He doesn't call much, but when he does, his voice carries a strength that wasn't there before, one born from surviving, not just enduring. Ray's still in Cooster. He helps with cold cases, but mostly he's become the keeper of small-town memory, the one people come to when they need something said out loud that others would rather let slip away. The town feels different now. Maybe it's the new faces at the school, or the plaque in the square, or just the way folks pause a little longer when they pass the old trailhead heads, bowed not out of shame anymore, but out of recognition. Ellie is gone, but she isn't lost. I see her in the way Thomas sits by the river listening, in the way the woods feel less like a place to hide and more like a place to return. I see her in the faded drawing I keep in my desk, two girls with paper binoculars and pine capes, still watching, still searching. Some wounds never close all the way. We don't get to choose what we remember or what we have to let go, but I know now that silence isn't the same as peace. We carry the ones we lost. We keep their stories alive, not because it makes the ending easier, but because it's the only way the world changes. This case taught me that justice can be slow, and healing isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just telling the truth even if your voice shakes. Sometimes it's listening to the questions no one else is brave enough to ask. If you found yourself holding on to this story, I hope you'll remember Ellie's name and all the others who never got a goodbye. And if you have a memory that haunts you, or a truth that's waiting to be heard, don't let it vanish. Share it. Someone out there is listening.